This is the Comics Alternative, episode 194. Reviews of The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan, Bird in a Cage, and Hellbound Lifestyle. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul. And we're two guys with PhDs, or in my case, almost there, talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Paul and I are going to discuss three really interesting and very different texts. We're going to begin with The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan by Bryan Doerries, with art from a variety of different creators. After that, we're going to look at Rebecca Rohr's Bird in a Cage. And then after that, we're going to wrap up with Kaeleigh Forsyth and Alabaster Pizzo's Hellbound Lifestyle. But before we get to those books, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials, and June is no exception. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Yeah, Derek, you know, as a regular DCBS customer, I take advantage of those specials and bundles whenever I can. There's some really enticing ones going on right now. And even though it's the end of the month, they accept late orders. And I think you and I often both make late orders. But there's a Valiant bundle. There's a DC Vertigo bundle. If you're into the kids' comics, there's a DC Hanna-Barbera bundle and a kids bundle. And of course, the DC Universe and Marvel bundles that you can find there. And so I encourage you to take advantage of those and check them out if you haven't. That's DCBS.
That's right. You can't find better deals than those at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Well, Paul, here we are with you co-hosting a regular review show. Now, in the past, you co-hosted with me on a previews episode. That was back in March. And then about a month ago, you and I did the interview with Mike Dawson. So now you're branching out and doing a regular review show.
Oh, this is great fun. Every time it's great fun. My regular role is as the editor of the blog portion of the Comics Alternative, which you can check out at comicsalternative.com. But as much as I enjoy listening to you and Derek and the others, there's always a little bit of envy. I always love to be involved in the conversation. So being in this chair is, as always, a total privilege.
Well, thanks, and it's fun to have you on as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned our blog because, you know, we're known primarily as a podcast, and that's right. Most of our output. But a few years ago, we started to publish reviews and comics-related commentary, and then interviews as well on our blog. And when was it? It was last year. When was it last year that you took over as editor, back in the fall? Yeah,
I think I officially took on the reins around January, but, you know, there was a little bit of run-up to that. But, yeah.
Yeah, so, and if anyone is interested in writing for the Comics Alternative, then they should get in touch with Paul.
Absolutely. Regular listeners to the show know what we cover and what we're into and the kind of depth of analysis that we enjoy. So you can email me at paul@comicsalternative.com if you are interested in contributing to our blog. We'd love to meet you.
Well, let's talk about the books that we're going to be discussing on the podcast episode for this week. And we're going to start with an interesting book published through Pantheon, and this is The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan. This is written by Bryan Doerries, but it's illustrated by a variety of different artists, and those include Jess Rolifson, Joelle Jones, Justine Mara Anderson, Dylan McConis, and Nick Bertozzi.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not totally certain about every single one of these, but I think that a number of these artists are affiliated in some way with the Sequential Artists Workshop there in Florida, and so I think that's part of their connection to this book, but it's quite a lineup.
Yeah, it is, and I'm glad that you mentioned SAW, the Sequential Artists Workshop, because Tom Hart, who we spoke with the beginning of the year, in fact, about his new book, is the one that heads that up, and he is listed as one of the editors of the Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan. So that would make sense. Now, the artists, the only ones that I'm familiar with are Joelle Jones and Nick Bertozzi. So I'm wondering if the others were associated with SAW, maybe students or former students.
Yeah, I believe so. I think one or two are at least instructors, if not otherwise affiliated, or students. And I knew those two, of course, quite well known. In fact, Joelle Jones has been nominated for an Eisner this year for her art, and in an upcoming piece of Eisner commentary that you can expect on the blog, one of our contributors, Nick Bridwell, takes a little time to talk about the glories of Joelle Jones's art. But I knew a little bit about Dylan McConis, and she's got I think some good-looking art here and elsewhere. So, but it's fun. I enjoy works like this that engage multiple artists because it's an exposure opportunity. You come for the Joelle Jones, you stay for the new faces that you see.
Yeah. Now, I was not familiar with any writings from Bryan Doerries, but according to the flap on the back of the book, it says he's a writer, director, and translator. He's a self-described evangelist for classical literature and its relevance to our lives today. And I think that's the best starting point with this book, The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan. So if we were going to introduce this, or at least the setup to this book, how would we do so?
I actually, if you can indulge me in a brief story, right after I got this book, and I pre-ordered it, I think the Pantheon pedigree enticed me to order it through DCBS. The day after it came, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine, and his mother is a professor at the University of Virginia, and she does a writer's workshop, and it was sort of a summer camp kind of thing that he attended as a young man, and he went back, now 20 years later or so, to a reunion, and one of the attendees and the speakers who had been in that workshop in the past was none other than Bryan Doerries, and so he started telling me the story about this person that he had been in the camp, in that writing camp with, who had gone on to use the sort of writing out of your passions, writing from your heart that they did in that camp, and had sort of applied it to his professional life. And so he told me all about Bryan Doerries, and I said, that sounds awfully familiar, and I realized that it was the very same author of The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan. And so what he does with his project called Theater of War, and I'm trying to remember the name of the larger project, I think it's called Outside the Wire, is he wants to bring to bear classical works to the almost the therapeutic and storytelling work that theater can be. And so they do put on theater performances, and he's even enrolled well-known actors to perform classical works, your Sophocles and in this case Homer, of course, and to use that as a starting point to invite the stories, the connections, and really the catharsis of people who've been through experiences such as war. Yeah.
And that's what we have in this new book, The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan, because we have, in a nutshell, an individual, Sergeant Jack Brennan, who takes Homer's Odyssey and shares the stories with the soldiers under him in ways that apply directly to their lives, what they have experienced or what they're about to experience. And I think it's the latter that seems to be the thrust of this book, because in many ways he's using the Odyssey as a way to prepare his men to return home, but also to put many of their histories, what they've experienced over in Afghanistan within certain context, right? So they can deal with it later. So in many ways, what he's doing functions as a preventative, which goes hand in hand with what you were describing in terms of Doerries' Outside the Wire and that larger project.
That's right. And they've done some work in prisons and things like that. But interesting that the connection of storytelling and, be it catharsis or therapy, should find its way to the comics medium, I think. I think often about how the stories that we read in comics and our engagement with them is, for many of us, a process of, let's say, helpful escape sometimes. Let's say, some projection of the things that we endure and encounter in life. And so, to me, it was quite powerful to know the backdrop of that story. I think if that wasn't there, it would have taken away something from this my reading of this work. But knowing that context adds a lot.
Exactly. And you were mentioning the story as therapy, or comics or narrative as therapy. It strikes me that this book is published by Pantheon. And I want to get back to a comment you made earlier, right? The cachet that Pantheon has in your eyes. But I think that this book would fit in very well, if not maybe even better than Pantheon, in Penn State Press's series of comics and medicine.
Yes.
And that's something that is relatively new. I think it's been around a couple of years or so. And in fact, early this year, Gwen and I reviewed a couple of their titles. And this is the kind of book, especially the therapeutic aspect, that could work really well in this series, in the Penn State series. But it's published by Pantheon. Now, I want to ask you a bit about your interests or your, leanings toward Pantheon. Are you one of those who, every time Pantheon puts out a new book, a graphic novel, because, they have a long history with graphic novels, are you, automatically on board?
Not necessarily, although, so many chips fell in their favor for me when they published The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai earlier this year by Sonny Liu. And I think that, and I've read books by Pantheon, but I didn't think their graphic novel line, especially, contrasted with others, jumped out to me as must-buys. But I think they are grabbing my attention with at least these two this year.
Yeah, and this is the same publisher that put out Mouse, that put out Persepolis,
right?
And so, it's almost as if they are some kind of pinnacle publisher, at least within trade publishing, right? When it comes to graphic novels, I think another thing that they have going for them, of course, they're also the ones that publish Chris Ware. Let us not forget,
right?
Or at least much of his work. They also stand out because they have quite a bit of history and especially funding behind them. So I think that if this book had been published by Penn State or any other publisher, I don't know if it would have gotten near the kind of exposure that it's gotten through Pantheon. If for no other reason, Pantheon has the wherewithal to send out review copies, to send out galleys, and that's not something that many publishers do at all.
That's right.
At least in comics.
That's true, and I think they have the prestige of, as you said, the works that you named. McGuire's Here is a Pantheon book, and I think they're living up to their name in the things that they publish. I think the assumption that just because a publisher has so much care in curating their line that every work lands is one that I try to avoid because that's just tough on my pocketbook. But I gotta say, I think as far as Jack Brennan, there's if you look at the page of who contributed to this book, you can tell that there are multiple hands in the endeavor. And I can imagine the conversations between publishers and creators where you had Bryan Doerries himself and his organization, the SAW, as you mentioned, and the list of names and editors and contributors is lengthy and a lot of accomplished people. To me, the result on the book, and I'm sorry if I'm cutting off anything further you wanted to say about Pantheon, but I'll connect it back. The effect on the book is that there's a lot of qualities about it that lend it universal appeal, but there's also a sort of soul that I feel a little bit is missing. When I look at books like Mouse and Persepolis, the presence of the author is so powerfully felt, and obviously Chris Ware as well. The fact of this having multiple hands in the production, I think it's got its pluses and minuses, but it almost feels corporate is the wrong word. I don't mean corporate in the sort of multinational corporation sense, but corporate in the sense that it's collectively created, which I think is intentional. But to me, there seems to be something missing because of that. I don't know if you felt that way at all as you read it.
I don't know if I felt that something was missing. I mean, I appreciated the collaborative aspect of this.
Yeah,
and, it gets back to what you were mentioning earlier about Saw. And so it's good to see that kind of work because I know that that's something that Tom Hart really does privilege.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that. I also liked the fact that it was structured artistically the way it was because I found that quite effective. Now we mentioned the artists who are a part of this book, but they don't all do the same thing, and
right.
There is a rhythm to their contribution. So, for instance, Chapter 1, which is titled The War Never Ends, is illustrated by Joelle Jones. The second chapter, Staying Off Course, illustrated by Justine Mara Anderson. The third chapter, Breaking the Spell, by Dylan McConis. And then Nick Bertozzi is the illustrator for the final two chapters, 4, Facing the Dead, and 5, Monsters and Men. But I guess you could call the framing or structural artist Jess Rulifson.
Yep.
Because Jess and his... I don't know Jess. Is Jess male, female?
She, yeah.
It's a she. Okay. She. Okay, because what she does is she provides the framing narrative in terms of the art. So anytime we're in the present, which is where Jack Brennan is talking to his men before they go back home, before they return home, kind of like Odysseus returns home.
Right.
Then that's Rulifson's art.
Right.
And sometimes, well, for me at least, often the shift in art style wasn't really noticeable, and I think that was a positive thing. In that I was caught up in the story, and I would get maybe 1 or 2 pages into a chapter and then note, oh, there was a change in art style. I mean, you can tell the differences, but I think I was involved in the story that was being told. Jack Brennan's telling the story, which is the story here,
right?
A meta story,
right?
That I just wasn't paying attention at first glance, at least, of the shift in artists.
Yeah, and sorry if I put the cart before the horse, or maybe a couple of horses, in starting to give my opinion about it being collaboratively made. I do love the fact that it's collaboratively created, and also if we didn't spell out clearly enough the way that the story is structured, it's exactly as you said. It's Jack Brennan talking to some soldiers as they prepare to go home. Jess Rulifson does the art for the framing story, which begins in the prologue, and then with each chapter we have a bit of the Odyssey, which he's retelling, and a bit of the soldiers' lives and their stories, which, that structure, that format, almost a call and response of storytelling, is the structure or the framing of the theater of war work that Doerries has done. And so it's in a very parallel fashion being able to relate the things that are the riches of classical literature, of, in this case, Homer's Odyssey, to the soldiers' lives. And what you're saying about the art, I agree. I think it's I think that having a consistent colorist does quite a lot to sort of smooth the transitions between the art styles. But I definitely agree that each artist brings something, I think, unique. If I stared long enough at the differences between the Joelle Jones and the Dylan McConis, I can see them, but not so jarring that it takes you out of the story.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are times where you can notice those differences, and that can disrupt the reading process because what that does is it momentarily takes you out of the story where you have to. You become aware of the fact that you're noticing something that is outside the narrative. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I guess that sometimes can be a potential liability when it comes to collaborative work of this sort. I thought that this was a strong book. I don't want to call it a criticism, but I would say the one concern that I have as a possible weakness, and others may disagree, is the kind of heavy-handed way that the book is introduced. And I mean that literally with introduction. At the very beginning of the book, there's a solid page here of text that gives the context. While waiting to fly home after a challenging 7-month deployment to Afghanistan, Sergeant Jack Brennan gathers his war-weary infantry Marines at a U.S. base in how do you pronounce that city? Kyrgyzstan, to tell them, in his own words, the oldest war story of all time. And then it goes into detail about the sergeant's love of classical literature, just like Doerries. His use of the Odyssey and what he's about to read to his men. If you take out that one page and you give the rest of the book to a reader who didn't know that introduction was there, that text-only introduction, would they get the same thing out of just reading the comic itself?
Right.
In other words, was that introductory text necessary?
Yeah, and I don't feel like it was, and I don't feel like it. I feel like it is necessary. I feel like it loses some of the power in the same way that I mentioned that for me, not knowing I think knowing the context of the work lended quite a lot of power to the story. Read as just comics, I guess my feeling about the book as I read it was, if I was looking for really good Homer adaptation, I'd be disappointed. If I was looking for very in-depth, explication of the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder or what, soldiers bring back with them from war, I would be somewhat disappointed. But I think the entire project is about the juxtaposition of the two. And so each on its own felt thin, bringing them together, and then those being in the context of this larger, these larger projects that Doerries is involved in, to me made it worthwhile. To me made it rich. And I've read a little bit of the book The Theater of War, which is Doerries' story of how he set up these readings of Sophocles, and soldiers who were returning from war would then subsequently tell their stories. And I feel like there's so much that can be done with a graphic novel medium that could ascend to the heights of that book, but in this case doesn't quite. And I think that's what I was referring to earlier when I said that there feels to be an authorial voice that's not as strong, that's missing. But what, to take that as the loss, the gain is that you really feel like this is an orchestration of multiple voices. It feels like a room full of people together, and I think that's very much the purpose of the book.
Right. And that gets me back to that introduction that we were discussing a moment ago, the text-only intro on page 7. I mean, I think that is probably one of the clearest indications of a singular voice, but then, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're suggesting is that after that, in other words, the comic proper, there seems to be either a diversity of voices or a quote-unquote voice without much of a center, which may not necessarily be a negative thing, I guess. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's well put. That's well put, because I think if you were to, if I could just throw this word out there, monological about what is sort of a ceremony of, shared enactment of a story so that we can all enter into and participate in it, so that we can connect our lives to this, more, universal classical tale, then you do want a chorus rather than the the single narrator. And I think the art, the variety of artists does that, and the way that, the different folks around the fire with the different soldiers around the fire with Jack Brennan bringing in their own stories. That seems to me the intention. It's a very communal kind of story.
Right. So in that way, the medium becomes the message, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you have many people, writing, illustrating, coloring, editing this project makes it a communal effort, just as Sergeant Brennan and the soldiers around him are all participating in the story. So it's not just Brennan telling the story of the Odyssey and trying to apply it to the lives of his soldiers, but it's the soldiers actively taking their own experiences and trying to see it within the context of classical literature.
Yeah. I think that's my feeling about it, and I enjoy it, actually. I mean, so to come back to Jess Rulifson, I took a look at some of her other art, and she's the artist, of course, for the framing story, as we said, Jack Brennan and his fellow soldiers. Mm-hmm. What I noted in the other art that she's done, and she's been published in a variety of places, and I think she's working on a longer-term project where she's interviewing soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq, is that the art that she's posted is really gorgeous for its specificity. It's the way that she captures faces and places with such distinctiveness, that this is real. And actually, I think that that's somewhat missing in her art in this work, maybe because Jack Brennan and company are really meant to be more stand-ins for our own experience. And so, the sort of place in the hot sun in the desert where they're standing around talking really could be almost anywhere, even though they try to specify it to some extent, because it's trying to be universal. And in trying to be universal, I think her art loses some of the distinctiveness and the flavor of how specific she is. But on the other hand, it opens the door for many to enter, so to speak. And I think that's kind of the effect of the work overall.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm not familiar with some of her other work, but you can find out more of what she's done by going to her website, Jess Rolfeson, and that's one word, .com.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So people can go there and see what we're referring to, or what you're referring to here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, with the exception of that prosy introduction, I think that this is a really strong work. And, one of the reasons why I feel that all-text intro may not be necessary is because you have, in essence, that context that's spelled out on the front book flap. Mm-hmm. So the book's paratext, the text that surrounds the main narrative itself, that supplements it and puts it into context, again, the book flap description gives you everything you need to know in order to skip that intro, which is kind of a repeat, to go right to the comic itself. In the prologue, that'll get you then to Chapter 1, Chapter 2, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yep. Overall, I like the book a lot. I think it's not subtle, but it's not trying to be. And instead, I actually sent it along to a friend who was not a veteran of war, but had served in the military for quite some time. And, just to get his read on it. He's also an avid comics reader, and, he was pretty positive. I think he felt like it was doing justice to the experience.
Oh, good. Well, Paul, do you want to move on to the next book that we're looking at this week?
I absolutely do, and I also kind of don't, because it it spoke to me so much that I was pretty moved. So I'm a little nervous walking into it, but I think I'll be okay. I'll keep my composure, Derek.
Okay. And this is Bird in a Cage by Rebecca Roher. This was published by Conundrum last month. And I absolutely love Conundrum. They do great things. We did a Conundrum Press Spotlight back almost a little more than a year ago. They're a publisher when I discovered them about 2 or 3 years ago that I absolutely fell in love with. And I think this book is a great representation of the kind of work that they do. Now, were you familiar with the work of Rebecca Roher before Bird in a Cage?
I had seen the early versions of this that were published on the Nib. So I'm wondering if we discussed this when we did have the previews episode together. I don't know if that was the month it was solicited, but I think I saw it then, was excited because I had seen the Nib comics. And, actually it was your Conundrum Press episode that, let me learn about their association with Canada, Council of the Arts, and things like that. So, I was really excited for this to come out. I had already... So, for more background, I think some of this was published in the Nib, and then Conundrum invited Roher to expand it into the graphic novel that we have here.
Right. Now, I did not read this, but Rohr's comic Mom Body was nominated last year for an Ignatz Award. And if you remember, Andy Wolverton and I did a Ignatz nominee special where we discussed as many of the nominees as we could. In other words, whatever we were able to get our hands on. And I tried to get us copies of some form or another of every single nominee. We got the vast majority, but unfortunately, Mom Body was one that I couldn't get a hold of in time. So we couldn't discuss that on the show. But it was Mom Body nominated last year for an Ignatz Award. Roher also has published comics in the anthology Maple Key Comics, which I'm aware of, but I've never gotten a copy of Maple Key Comics. Have you?
No. I actually didn't even know about it.
Yeah. So even though I had heard of her before, this is the first book of hers that I've read, and I guess the same with you, outside of the Nib entries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what we should say here, and this will get to something that you mentioned in a very personal way, and I can speak to that to some degree as well. Mm-hmm. What this book is about, and this is about the death. The aging and the death of Rebecca Rohr's grandmother,
That's
Mary
right.
Campbell, who was known by the family as Grandma Wiley. And I found that charming in that her name came from her dog, because years ago, their grandmother Campbell had a dog that she absolutely loved called Wiley. And so they eventually started to call her Grandma Wiley.
Yeah, just one of the really sort of cute and poignant, little tidbits that this book is full of.
Exactly, and I think charming would be a good way of describing this book, because it is a very sentimental narrative, and I don't mean sentimental in a negative sense, right?
Mm-hmm,
where there is melodrama and there is an overemphasis on the emotional. The emotional is definitely there. But I say sentimental in that I think that the author is very much aware of her own feelings, and maybe even more importantly, the feelings of her audience that she's writing to. So, one way of looking at Bird in a Cage is a story about the grandmother, right? Grandma Wiley.
Right.
But another way of approaching Bird in a Cage is as either the story of Rohr's family, extended family, and the family history, or along with this, Rebecca's story, Rebecca Rohr's own story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those layers are really apparent from the outset. One of the, in the opening pages, you have a family tree, which it's quite extensive and stretches in many directions. And as soon as I saw that, I braced myself for a long, disquisition on family dynamics. But I think actually centering on their experience, plural, with Grandma Wiley's latter years, was great. There was a sense of multiple lenses. There was a sense of how the entire family comes together, and of Rohr's own experience. And I remember the note that she made that, these recollections are my own. I may have gotten it wrong, and I can tell there's a nod there to her family members who may not remember events in quite the same way. But isn't that true of all of our experiences and memories of family? That we have our own take, and it's as much truth as anyone else's, but we all sort of experience it differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, I'm glad that you mentioned the allusion at the very beginning, or the words at the beginning. This book is a work of memory. I may not reflect the recollection of others. And then we're thrown into the first part of the book, which really says a lot about what this book is about. She writes, "It was the weekend of the family sing-song, and the last time we would take Grandma to the cottage." And what I mean by that first page tells you a lot of what will be going on in Bird in a Cage. Much of it does take place at this cottage on Silver Island, which is a part of the Muldrew Lakes region. And so Roher, through her narratives about her grandmother and other family members, describe the place of that cottage on Silver Island, what it meant to her, what it meant to the family, what it meant to her great-grandparents, who basically started things off there. Another thing about that opening page is when she said it was the weekend of the family sing-song. Now, we learn what that is later in the book, that it's an occasion where what's become for them annually, they get together, and part of that get-together at the cottage on the island is to share time through song. But singing in a broader sense is a major theme of Bird in a Cage, as you can tell from the title itself.
Right. I think the title is so fitting because singing is one of the themes that occurs. They're being out in the cottage, which is also in a sense being out in a different sort of nature for these folks, and also the sense that her grandmother is this strong, independent, free spirit who you can just tell even when she's more well, and also after the accident that causes some I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but some brain damage that
early onset dementia.
Yeah, early onset dementia, right? That's more accurate. But throughout all that, there's this freedom. She's a bird that's meant to fly, and if you're trying to protect and in some sense contain her, that's challenging, and those are among the challenges that they face in this narrative. But on the other hand, I think that's the inspirational part of her grandmother's story and her life, is that spirit that is very much a bird that wants to fly.
Oh, exactly. And in fact, in the opening pages of this book, where we're given quite a bit of exposition about Grandma Wiley, as you mentioned, she was hit by a car. In fact, she was 82 years old during this accident, and she was crossing the street after doing some Christmas shopping, was hit. It caused some brain damage, some early onset dementia resulted eventually. She was unconscious for a number of days, but then after she wakes up, she seems different, and one of the things the family notices almost immediately is that she really can't care for herself anymore, which is something that, is very devastating for someone as independent as Grandma Wiley.
Yeah.
So in the first several places where they take her, places to live, she ends up going out many times without people noticing, and no one knows where she is, because she wants to go here, go there, and many times she said she wants to find home. She wants to go home. But by this time, her actual literal home has been sold, so it's no longer where she lives anymore.
Right.
And so throughout the first half of this book, it seems, it's as if when the grandmother's wandering off, she's looking for a home. And we learn later on that this home is something like that cottage on Silver Island. But yeah, it's this her attempts to fly through the bars of the cage, right? That causes the problem. If we want to stick with this metaphor of a bird in a cage.
Yeah. There's definitely a feeling that you can empathize with the experience of feeling rootless when you're, by necessity moved around, and you have to improvise housing situations because of the care that you need. But meanwhile, at the base, our hearts, our minds long for home. And I think that's a lot of the significance of the cottage and the family being together and songs is the sense of familiarity to Grandma Wiley, the sense that this is, who she is and where she can be free in
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that is so moving about this is, at least for the two of us, right? And I don't want to suggest by what I'm about to say that those who haven't gone through somewhat similar experiences can't really empathize or can't get a lot out of this book.
Right.
But both you and I right now are going through situations in our lives, you with your mother and me with my father, where having read Bird in a Cage, it hits us in a way that I think it wouldn't have hit us maybe a few years ago.
Yeah. What's funny is I read Roz Chast's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, which I think is a work that's interesting to compare and contrast with this.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah, I read that before my mom got the stage 4 lung cancer that that we've been battling for the last number of years, and it was actually very enjoyable and very relatable in some respects, but and so I agree that Bird in a Cage can appeal to you whether you are in the particular situation we're in or not. On the other hand, I had to say I was reading it while staying with my mom in her home, and man, it just hit me. Rebecca Roher, if you're listening, I just want to thank you for turning me into a blubbering idiot, crying into tissue paper while at my mom's house, because there were just so many things that were, I think there's a bittersweet, and this is, I think, where the tone is a little different from Roz Chast, and there's definitely something more Toronto than New York about Bird in a Cage, but it's just so bittersweet. It's so dearly able to honor her grandmother, but without, as you said, getting into sort of schmaltzy sentimentalism.
Oh, right, definitely. And there's nothing maudlin about this book.
Nothing, yeah. And so that spoke right to me. It spoke to my own experience, as well as the humor of those moments when you're just sort of like, I don't know, this doesn't make any sense, and we're just doing the best that we can and trying to love and see the person that is sometimes hard to see through the layers of, medication treatments and tubes and so forth that they're surrounded by.
Oh, exactly. I want to get back to the singing or the song part of this book. That's embedded in the book's title. We see it from the very first page when they're going to the island, where she's remembering a time where they're going to the island for their family sing-song. Mm-hmm. I said earlier that you could look at this not just as the grandmother story, but also, Rebecca Rohr's, it may be better yet, the family. Mm-hmm. It's the family thing that I think really stands out for me, especially with the singing, because we often see members of the family, whether they're at the island in the cottage or elsewhere, for instance, at the home that the grandmother stays, mm-hmm. singing.
Right.
And it's never one person doing the singing. There may be one or two occasions where one person carries song by herself.
Yeah.
And I say herself intentionally because this is primarily a female-driven narrative in terms of its family members.
Yeah.
But it's a communal kind of song.
Right.
And it's coming together through music that I think really what binds the members of this family together, provides solace, provides some kind of comfort, or if you want to look at it this way, provides that kind of home that Grandma Wiley was seeking at the beginning of this book.
Yeah. I guess to take it personal again, my mother is the 9th of 10 children, mostly sisters. As children, they were essentially the sound of music. They were a Chinese, the sound of music, and to me, part of the significance of the singing is, there's a lot of this, and to relate this back to this being comics, is there's just so many things that music does that words can't, even when the music has lyrics, and there's also so many things that images do and drawings do that words fail to do or fail to convey in quite the same way. And so the act of coming together to sing and the familiarity of that and the sense of home in that is ineffable. I think if we had words for it, then we wouldn't make a song.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the Toronto quality of this as opposed to, let's say, the New York quality of, can we please talk about something more pleasant?
Yeah.
And I don't know if this represents a Canadian mindset or not.
Right.
I've never lived in Canada. I've had friends who are from Canada, but, what the hell do I know?
Right.
But there seems to be a sense of acceptance in this book and understanding in ways that you may not find as much, or at least as strongly in the Roz Chast book, or in others that deal with a similar matter, the aging parent or needing to let someone go. Because, we find this with the character in this narrative, Rebecca herself. We've got Rebecca the author and then Rebecca the character within her own story. Mm-hmm. She, as well as her mother and her other family members, never seem to be overwhelmed with what's going on with the mother. They seem to care for her in a measured way, in an understanding way. In fact, they have patience far beyond mine. But they also understand when it's about time for her to go, because toward the end of the book, they're reading a pamphlet about dying family members dying, and they talk about the death rattle, and they wonder if the death rattle is something that is understood differently by different cultures.
Yeah, several things we could talk about in relation to that, and right, who are we as non-Canadians or non-Torontons or whatever to attribute this, but I do. It's hard to imagine Roz Chast sitting around with the family members singing, as saying that I loved. Can't we talk about something more pleasant? It was probably more reflective of my own personality than otherwise. But even in the art, Chast has this wonderful anxiety in her line. Whereas I think Roher, with it's a very sort of, I don't know if it's pencil. I'm not an artist, so I don't know if it's more of a pencil-y flavor or, I don't. It's rendered as if it were with pencil or that kind of medium. It's there's something really simple and beautiful, and I don't know if clean is the right word, but yeah, that matches the tone that you're describing.
It's casual. It seems more casual. And one of the things is yes, exactly. Now the style, the pencil style, contributes to that. But for me, it's the lack of panel borders. So I mean, I don't want to suggest that what Roher is doing here is similar to what Will Eisner did with his lack of borders. But the effect is somewhat similar in that you have one quote-unquote panel of her story seems to flow or meld more easily into the other. In other words, there's no kind of overt separation between these images.
Right.
And along with that, I think that helps to contribute to the almost seamless way that the past and the present come into play in this narrative. Because there are many moments that I had to catch myself. For instance, Roher is writing about a memory of something, let's say an event when she was a kid, on the island with her grandmother, and then we're brought back to the present, but there's no indicator of any sort, visually or even texturally, that we're going from the past to the present or vice versa. And I like that because what it does is it shows the fluidity of memory, not just going between memory and the current lived experience, but also between memory and other memories, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of a fluidness to this story that is accentuated by the fluidity of the art, especially given their borderless panels.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's really lovely. I mean, that reminds me of one of my favorite panels, if that's the right word in this context. I absolutely agree that the not having borders in the panels creates that effect. But one of my favorite moments where they're checking out different places to have Grandma Wiley stay, and there's a one place where it's a closed door, but she says no one could leave because the mural painted over the exit, and you can see this doorway where there's an octopus in an underwater scene, and so underneath that panel is the words, "So Grandma was safe," sort of sardonically, like, oh, everything's okay because they painted this underwater scene on a wall. But I think it's reflective of the idea of the cage, or maybe that there's no way to cage this bird. That both, as you said, the movement of memory into the present, whatever that may be, and also the way that probably in the existence and the experience of Grandma Wiley, even in dementia, past and present are not so rigidly bound, can be something obviously frustrating when you're trying to create a schedule or something, but also true to our human experience and also marvelous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing, again, seeing Grandma Wiley as a bird who wants to fly away, who always wants to get away and go through those bars of the cage. Mm-hmm. When she's no longer able to do that literally, in other words, leave wherever it is she's staying, right?
Yep.
Maybe without anyone knowing. She seems to do the same in this last half of the book, but it's an inward retreat, right?
Yeah.
So that we don't know what kind of inward retreat she's escaping into or temporarily walking into, if you want to look at it that way. But, I mean, it could be these memories that Rebecca and other family members are bringing up in this story, but we don't know that because we don't have access to Grandma Wiley's interior.
Yeah.
Now, along with that, I do find it interesting that the one place in this story where we do get Grandma Wiley's voice is toward the very end of the book, and this, I think, begins on page 91. Mm-hmm. This is, again, toward the end of the grandmother's life, and they discover a brief essay that the grandmother had written about her becoming Baha'i, following the Baha'i faith, and it's titled "My Being a Baha'i."
Yes.
And so basically, Rebecca is reading, either Rebecca or her mother, I can't remember which, is reading this. And so for the next several pages, whenever we see text that looks like typed text, I mean, Roher is writing this out, but she's writing it in a particular font that makes it look like it comes from a typewriter.
Yeah.
We know that that's the grandmother's voice, and every now and again, the narrator, Rebecca, Roher, steps in, and her voice is marked by more of a writerly kind of font. Yep. Right? So we know through those several pages, as this essay is being read, where the voice of the grandmother is and where the voice of the narrator is.
Yeah, that's really keen, and I thought I was pretty moved by the text itself, but I think both the font with the serif, with the feet, that's sort of like the typewritten testimonial of her coming to the Baha'i faith, in the ways that shows it confirms exactly the person that we see through the eyes of her family members, somebody who is independent and yet is highly careful and conscious and loving of her family, and yet, in her heart sort of is seeking out the world. And the other place where we get maybe a tiny sense of her interiority is the fact that she is throughout, referenced as totally in love with word puzzles, that she's a crossword nut, and she would cart around this library of reference materials so that she could work on crossword puzzles. And, as something of a puzzle aficionado myself, I think that shows a lot about who she is, where even when you're sitting in a room, your mind has to wander over the globe in search of the things that those crossword puzzles push you to. So, in both instances of her relationship to text, Grandma Wiley shows herself to be exactly the person that I think that the view from the family members shows us.
Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the connections between Bird in the Cage and what we were just discussing in terms of the Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan. I mean, we always like to look at books that are different each week on the podcast, right?
Yeah.
Instead of looking at the same kind of things, same genre or what have you. I guess with some exceptions. But at the same time, it's always useful to find common ground among the various books that we discuss. In both the Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan and Bird in a Cage deal with communal voices in one way or another, as we pointed out. But another thing that the two have in common is I think you could define both of these texts as therapeutic in nature.
I was so wrapped up in the therapeutic effect of Bird in the Cage that I hadn't noticed it. But yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and therapeutic in terms of Bird in the Cage for, I think, the audience, right? But
Right.
You could say the same thing with Rebecca Roher herself.
Yeah.
Although, when people say art can be used as therapy, sometimes I feel really mixed about that. I
Yeah.
mean, sure, of course, but that's not the sole reason, I would think,
Yep.
that an artist creates in whatever medium he or she chooses to work. But I think this is just therapeutic for readers, definitely like you and me, who are going through somewhat similar experiences with our parents right now.
Yeah, totally agree. I hadn't thought much about that, but that makes me curious whether Dr. Kunka touches on that in his forthcoming work on memoir.
A memoir, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of finding common ground, I don't know if I would call this last book that we're looking at, Hellbound Lifestyle, as therapeutic, although arguably I guess it could be. But I definitely think that we could apply this whole idea of a communal voice or voices to it, in that it deals with smartphone technology. And in fact, this entire book surrounds what we could call a year in the life of a smartphone, or at least a smartphone user. Now, this is written by Kaeleigh Forsyth with art by Alabaster Pizzo, and I'm not familiar with anything that Forsyth had done in the past. I was trying to look her up, and I didn't see any other books. Was I missing something? Are you familiar?
No, and I think that's accurate. Retrofit, who should say is the publisher, has
Right.
has of course, Box
Retrofit
Brown.
Big Planet, yeah.
Yeah, Retrofit Big Planet. Box Brown has a knack for finding these kind of unique voices, and what I gather is that Kaeleigh Forsyth is a writer and a humor columnist in some places, but really she's a youngish person with a smartphone, and I've been talking all this stuff about taking care of the elderly and so forth. I probably should mention that I grew up listening to gangster rap, and I'm 35 years old, and I'm totally attached to my cell phone as well, and and occasionally on Tumblr, and so I can relate to this. The sense that when as you just described, it's about a year in the life of a cell phone. Sadly, or whatever, take it for what you will. That is the life of a human being. Is the life of their cell phone.
Yeah, and so maybe a number of really younger listeners, or maybe not so young listeners, who are about your age. Not that you're old, because I'm older than you are. Would this book would really resonate with? Now, I mentioned that I wasn't familiar with the work of Kaeleigh Forsyth, but I do know of, although I haven't read, books by Alabaster Pizzo. She did a couple of volumes of Mimi and the Wolves, which was published not too long ago by Hickenhock, and I've seen those books, but I've never read them. So, but I remember when I looked her up, I thought, oh, I recognize them. I remember when they came out. I just don't have any firsthand experiences with Mimi and the Wolves. So Pizzo has published elsewhere, but this may be Forsyth's first book, perhaps.
I think so, and I think the premise, and just to describe the book a bit, is that Forsyth's, and I don't know if this is authentically what was on her cell phone, but it was the notes app on her cell phone that Pizzo went and and with her of course distinctive voice and sense of humor that Pizzo then adapted to to comics form, which I think is really funny and fun and fitting. Now, am I wrong that Pizzo's work appeared in one of those Best American Comics anthologies? Is that the case? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, I might be mistaken.
That's something that we could look up, I guess.
If we had something like the internet or a smartphone or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that most of what we read here are the notes that Kaeleigh puts into her smartphone. And that's true, but there are other apps that tell the story in this book as well. So sometimes the story is told through her chat app,
right.
where she's messaging a friend, or
right.
through email. So we get her story through different apps or through different means or however she uses her smartphone. But the majority of what we're reading here are in her notes, and she even dates her notes, right? So it begins, the very first note, appropriately enough, January 1st, 2015, at 9:06 p.m., and if we read it, it says, "Problems I've learned to live around." So maybe this is something kind of like a New Year's resolution, or at least a New Year's awareness.
Right.
Bedroom door has had half a doorknob for a year. And then we have Pizzo's art, which shows what this looks like.
Yeah.
Must restart phone every 30 minutes.
That's great. Yeah. That's so rich.
Yeah.
And the illustration, if we should probably describe it, must restart phone every 30 minutes, something that, us high-volume cell phone users know the experience of. Pizzo's illustration is of a, I guess, of Forsyth having fallen off her bike, bloodied. The bike is in tatters, her body's in tatters, and she's still staring at her phone, watching it restart.
Exactly. And you have that kind of arrangement throughout most of this book, and
right.
that is you have the notes, or let's say the messaging or email text.
Yep.
That is more times than not really funny in nature, and especially the humor is accentuated with Pizzo's art.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this book. I can't turn off what is to me a naturally, nerdy analytic brain, but I always fear that I'm going to drain a humorous work of its wit by dissecting it a bit too much. But
well, that's what academics do, right?
That's right. That's what we're in the business of.
I tell all my students many times when we're about to read a text or watch a film, it's like, you may enjoy movies, but I tell you, after taking this film class,
no longer. It's
going to ruin movie watching for the rest of your lives, believe me.
Right. But so let me throw that obnoxious theorizing cap on. I would be really interested in thinking about this work vis-a-vis some of Neil Cohn's work about visual language, because when I think about the ways that comics trains us to read texts and images in juxtaposition, to me this work is reflective of what's occurring in the cell phone generation, in the smartphone generation, where my friends and I will send each other text messages. I think my parents' generation would probably look askance at the terrible spelling and so forth, but there's quite a lot of implication in the language, and people use so often with their cell phone and their tweets and so forth now the juxtaposition of text and image, sometimes ironically in relationship, and sometimes in sort of a disjuncture that's humorous or meaningful, that I think it gets played up quite often here. I don't know do you get animated GIFs, Derek? Are you
not often? No.
Okay. It's something that I've noticed people doing more and more, and my wife and I sort of laugh at ourselves about it, because friends will text each other, and rather than reacting with words, they'll paste an animated GIF of a reaction. It's a person's face reacting a certain way, and it's just hilarious sometimes how appropriate that small moving image is. And so, and being a scholar of literacy, I'm really interested in how we become trained through pop culture to understand the relationship of text and images and their proliferation around us. And again, to overanalyze a bit, I think that this book employs that in just really comical ways.
Right. And much of the comedy is also embedded in the technology through which the text and image is related to us, right? So,
right.
I mean, we see the protagonist of this story, which, seems to be Kaeleigh Forsyth. She's referred to as Kaeleigh Forsyth, the actual writer of this, going through the year with her smartphone and the way that she engages with it, and then the way that she also communicates and engages with others through the phone. Because even with the notes, right, that she's writing for herself, I think you could make the argument that she's writing this for an audience as well.
Yeah.
And I think that the Pizzo's art kind of brings that out, right?
Yeah.
Because that's part of the humor.
Yeah.
But other examples of the text where she is communicating, let's say, with her roommate or one of her friends through a chat or a message program or via email, it's bringing people together. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, at least maybe finding or maybe forcing a connection among these three books that we're looking at this week is the emphasis on the communal voice.
Yeah.
Because even though the character here, Kaeleigh in Hellbound Lifestyle, is writing for herself, she's also writing for and to others, but it's others from a distance through the technology. And I don't really have a problem with that, although I can see where some people may feel in a broader sense that things such as smartphones have affected our life in kind of a negative way, right? So when we communicate and interact with people from a distance, that disconnects us from them. It makes us less empathic. And as a result, we become kind of isolated, even though we're trying to constantly, through social media and its technology, connect with others. So there's an irony there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she plays that up quite a lot. She makes some references to comedy. And in fact, there's a whole bit about, stand-up that's kind of funny. But I think a lot of the comedy of your Jerry Seinfelds and she mentions Paula Poundstones, a little bit self-deprecating, but also just sort of, a reflection of how things are. But there's a certain, a funny passage in this where she's, posted something on social media and she's waiting for likes, and it's sort of like she can't go on until she gets those likes. And so she's lying down in a park, and behind her folks are walking their dogs and riding bicycles, and meanwhile she's lying down waiting for her post to get enough likes to satisfy her sense of existence, And she says, "I'm not psychologically fit for social media," which is a great line. But it's exactly as you say. There's a way in which the accessibility of these screens and the whole world that it's supposed to connect us to brings us so near to the world, and yet leaves us also at the same time totally alienated, totally disconnected from the world around us.
Exactly.
And maybe a false promise of connection sometimes.
Now, you mentioned that funny scenario where she posts something on Facebook and then is obsessed with getting likes in order to justify her own sense of self and feel better about who she is. I mean, there are many examples throughout this book of these funny anecdotes, and not all of them centered on the technology itself.
Right.
One of my favorites comes, I guess, relatively late in the book, and I don't think we have page numbers here, so I can't refer to a page number, but this is in her notes that she writes for September 15th, 2015, and she begins it at 1:17 a.m., so that may tell you something.
Right.
And she titles this note, "A Day in the Life of Hemingway's Wife or Wives."
Right.
And I think that this is, to me, one of the funniest parts of this book. And she writes, just wrapped up, apparently in the voice of Hemingway's wife, just wrapped up a 20-hour shift washing dishes in a 150-degree dungeon. Get home to discover my freak idiot bitch of a husband has spent our income on a bottle of champagne. He seems to think this is a romantically impulsive gesture, but I have sores on the bottom of my feet, and now we have no food, so I'm not so sure. Moreover, he just told me with a hearty chuckle that he locked our son in a cage so he could go write somewhere quiet, the pub downstairs.
Right.
I read the brilliance this solitude yielded, and it looks like shit. And, of course, it's written in kind of a Hemingway style. It was a good morning. No one was there. I waited. And then the rest of this is just hilarious. You know, she talks about she thinks that her husband's writing is shit, but as she puts it, mouth-breathing American intelligentsia lap it up.
Right.
I mean, this is funny. And so you can see that the character Kaeleigh and the author, Kaeleigh Forsyth, are very funny. But whereas the character Kaeleigh is using her smartphone to bring out this side of her, the actual creator, Kaeleigh Forsyth, is using the comics to bring out the humor about a reliance on modern technology.
Yeah. And on the other hand, I think that story, as hilarious as it is, I don't even know if story is the right word, that bit of narrative, it's part of the reason it's funny is because we hear this voice that history has. Actually, I'm not a Hemingway scholar, so I don't know that, but that largely history has excluded. That we spend hours slaving over Hemingway's words and the perspective of what it must be to have to carry on the daily existence around him is lost to us because it's not in the annals of literature. And yet a woman with a smartphone sitting at a cafe manages to chronicle her mundane daily thoughts and to get that written and expressed in a way it sort of brings in a funny way into sharp relief the difference that it makes when we all have the tools to communicate and be seen versus being filtered through the intelligentsia that she alludes to.
Right. Now, interestingly enough, and I was just flipping through and noticed this, and I'm sure there's no connection whatsoever, but we were talking about Hemingway. Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that we have another example of this kind of male intrusion. And again, we don't have page numbers here, but this is in a February entry of her notes where she's referring to being intrigued by someone she sees on Tinder.
Right.
who basically has a profile of nothing but dick pics.
Right. Mm-hmm. Dick pics, for those who don't know. No, I'm kidding. That's self-explanatory. Yeah.
And then right after that is another one of my favorite anecdotes, and this is when she wants to take a writing test for a product called Sunny Lovies, which is a company that makes sunglasses. Mm-hmm. And she wants to try to write copy in a way that reflects the corporate voice. Mm-hmm. But she's not able to really do it because when she comes up with copy, it's something like, I publicly wept all day, but no one knew, thanks to my Sunny Lovies. Right. Avoiding optical nerve damage from increased UVB intensity due to climate change with Sunny Lovies. And so she goes through a series of these that are just really hilarious.
Yeah.
I regret having my child, but I can never vocalize this. Sunny Lovies. And of course, they have a hashtag with Sunny Lovies. So again, that brings in the social media aspect.
Yeah, so good, so good. I mean, she what she does really well is to play up how funny it is that sometimes language, because of our phones, shows up in places where it just utterly doesn't belong. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many times have I been in a hospital waiting room and then somebody texts me like a ridiculous picture of somebody's butt, or there's another of my favorite, and this is sort of not much. Well, no, that's not fair. I was about to say not much comics, but it totally is comics. But it's a series of. She says I bought a language learning app to kill the time. Oh yeah. And so there's all these ridiculous sentences that are translated, such as "the tailor is my dealer," or "don't forget about death." The language learning app, if you played with those, gives you a sentence, you have to translate it. And so or translate the sentence: "Esto es soledad." This is loneliness. You're just picturing yourself playing with this app, having to translate these sentences that just are, the wrong time and place. But it's kind of, again, one of the effects of technology is we wind up having these bits of language and experience wind up in a context that you don't expect.
Das Dorf wird brennen. The village will burn. So,
yeah.
Again, this is one of those books that you can't help but laugh as you read it. And, when you and I were talking before we started to record this week's podcast episode, we decided to discuss this as the last of the three books that we were discussing, because the first two are rather heavy, right? The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan deals with traumatic issues and how soldiers who are trying to transition back into quote-unquote normal life have a hard time of it. And then with Bird in a Cage, obviously it deals with the death of a loved one and how an individual and an entire family deals with that. Here we have something quite a bit more lighthearted. And so instead of ending on a down note, we wanted to discuss something that was very, very funny.
It's a good tone to end on, and a reminder that, again, as I mentioned a little bit when we were talking before, there's certainly plenty of serious stuff that comics allows us to touch, but comics are also really good for that much needed medicine of some lighthearted escape.
That's right.
Some laughing at ourselves.
So we had a lot to discuss for this week. We began with the Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan, written by Bryan Doerries with several artists. Then we moved on to Rebecca Rohr's Bird in a Cage, and we wrapped up with the lighthearted, if we want to call it that, Hellbound Lifestyle by Kaeleigh Forsyth and Alabaster Pizzo.
It was really fun to talk about these comics. All three, I think, are worth checking out if you're on the fence on any of them. But yeah, thanks for including me in the conversation, Derek.
Sure. Yeah, it's always fun to talk about these great books with you. And if our listeners want to find great discounts on great comics, then they would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Please do go to dcbservice.com. We can guarantee you can't find better prices. Both Paul and I order our comics through them, and you should too. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe, which is an easy program to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your telephone and calling 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Yeah, speaking of the communal experience with texts and stories, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. I can be reached personally at paul@comicsalternative.com, or you can reach out to Derek as well.
At derek@comicsalternative.com, appropriately enough. We're all over the social media sphere, so you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can listen to us on Spotify. And if you're an Android user, listen to us through Google Play Music. But you can always find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the commentary that Paul edits on our blog, and that's by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
Send us likes, because we're waiting by the phone for those likes, and we can't go on with life without them.
Exactly. It makes us feel good about ourselves and our podcast. So while you're doing that, we'll be waiting to hear from you. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul.
We'll see you later.